A recent news story describes a woman who has a near-death experience, but is this evidence that a God exists? We'll discuss it on this episode.
J. Warner Wallace is a cold case homicide detective who's been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Dateline, and Court TV. Now, we join him as he applies his investigative skills to making a case for Christianity.
Welcome to this edition of the Cold-Case Christianity Broadcast. I'm Jimmy Wallace.
And I'm J. Warner Wallace. And we're going to step out into some territory that you and I will both admit up front that we are not experts in this area. And part of the reason why we've never really dug into this all that deeply is because the first reports that I've read in a number of different places have really kind of, for me at least, given me enough skepticism that I just don't see the value. Maybe I'm misinterpreting the value of near-death experiences. And then certainly you and I have friends who have done really good work and really do think that near-death experiences are an evidence of not just God's existence, but of the truth of Christianity. And we get asked these kinds of questions a lot. Like, why don't you guys ever talk about near-death experiences as an evidence for? If I was going to make a case, I mean, if you made a case for God right now, or for Christianity, would you even include NDE as part of the cumulative case?
Yeah, I can tell you that at least when I very first heard about this idea, people have near-death experiences and this is some type of evidence for Christianity, I personally was very skeptical. I think if I was somebody who is not a Christian and I just heard the claim, near-death experiences show that God is real or something along those lines, I would be very... I would just think that was such an outlandish claim that I probably, maybe it's my own bad attitude, but I probably wouldn't give very much mind to it. But I think if we really stop to think about what are near-death experiences and what can we really glean from them, I think there is some value. I think that, I guess I'm to the point where as a Christian, and to be fair, I think I couldn't exclude them from the overall cumulative case, even though I know if I was a skeptic, I would be hesitant to even listen to the evidence to begin with.
Well, and let's just kind of define our terms for a second. What we're really talking about and you see this in the press all the time, we're going to read a story today of a recent one. The idea being that people will lose consciousness and actually stop breathing. Their hearts will stop. In other words, all the indicators and signs that we would use to determine that someone is dead, these folks would possess. Lack of a pulse, lack of breathing. I think there's even some cases where they might have a lack of brainwave activity for some period of time. And then when they are revived, they are either medically treated, they are saved by some rescue personnel, and when they are revived and come back to consciousness, they report an event that demonstrates that they had an out-of-body experience of some type, an experience in which they either saw God or saw Jesus or saw something that resembles heaven as described in scriptures or heaven as inferred from scripture, whatever it may be. But this post-life experience, they would say, is evidence that the claims of Christianity, because we are dualists, substance dualists, in the sense that we believe that we are bodies and souls. We are souls and possessions of bodies. And the idea here is that once you leave the body, that you still have a life. The mind does not, even though the brain may die, the mind does not die. Your soul does not die. And you might experience something that, when brought back to life, you could then report. And so a lot of people look at these, and they've been collected now for a number of years, right? And so I think, I've got my own hesitation as well. But what was it, though? You said you felt like that's the kind of thing that you might be hesitant, and you think that a non-believer would be. Why do you think a non-believer would be hesitant when hearing a story like this? I
think I'm always skeptical of anything that sounds too good to be true, because as a Christian, I want, if there's evidence that's too good to be true for Christianity, of course, as a Christian, I would love for that to be true. I would love for the case to be as easy to make as possible. I do think that there's overwhelming evidence for Christianity, but I wish there was even more overwhelming than it even is. But also, as a skeptic, or even as a Christian, if I hear evidence for some other worldview, and it seems to be so extremely strong for that other worldview, I am immediately hesitant to accept it, because I think like, oh, that seems too good to be true. As a skeptic, I would be thinking, oh, Christians are just loading the deck. They think that people are routinely having encounters with Jesus, and that, I mean, that's just too good to be true. And so I think that maybe it's just an attitude issue, but I would just be hesitant to too quickly. It's not that I would never accept that type of evidence, but I'm hesitant to too quickly accept things that just seem to overwhelmingly favor one side or the other.
Well, I wonder if some of this skepticism doesn't come from Hollywood, or so many of these stories now, heaven is real, all these stories have been turned into movies of one nature or another. And of course, when you create a movie, not everything it's not a nonfiction documentary. This is a fictional account of a real experience that someone's had, and they are often embellished, not because they're trying to fool us about the experience itself, just because you're making a movie. And because these things end up in fictional movies, I wonder if people just think, yeah, it's the same amount of, how do I know where to draw lines between what's real and what's not real? I also have seen a couple of these that have gone to movies and then just had somebody down the road debunk some aspect of the movie or some aspect of the experience, and then you're left with even further skepticism about I don't think, for example, most people, when they talk about near-death experiences, they aren't thinking about the entire range of documented NDEs and compare, all the data that's gathered from those. They're probably thinking in their minds about one or two stories that they either read in a fictional book, or not a fictional book, but a Christian book, or they saw in a movie. And so because it comes out of that world, I wonder if outsiders watching this say, yeah, that's all fiction. That's Hollywood. You don't believe the Avengers movies, do you? Why would you believe this thing,
Yeah, and I think for me, I would feel like, hey, there's a number of smart people to any worldview. There's smart people who are Christians, smart people who are atheists, smart people who are Muslims. But any group has smart people. So therefore, that if a single piece of evidence seems to overwhelmingly be just so clear cut, it makes me skeptical of, is that evidence really there? Does it really say what it wants to say? Because then wouldn't any rational person immediately accept that evidence and then accept the worldview that it points to? I know that the way we come to our beliefs doesn't necessarily work exactly like that, but that's why I'm sometimes skeptical of really overwhelming evidence for any one particular view, because I think, why is it that not everybody accepts that? If it's so strong, so clear, why is it not everybody accepts that? So it makes me doubt it just off the bat, before I've even heard it.
So let's just go ahead and take a look at this example that's been most recently reported. And I'm reading it from CBN News. Woman dies, meets Jesus face to face in heaven, gets brought back to life, and writes, "It's real." She writes, "It's real." So basically, it's about a report that occurred in 2018. A woman who suffered a heart attack or a failure, and they end up calling it's at home when it occurs. They end up calling the fire department. Rescue people come. Just happened to have somebody like a neighbor who knew how to do CPR happened to be there. So they immediately try to give her CPR. They cannot bring her back while she's at the house. They end up transporting her to the hospital. And so the story is reported in CBN.com. And here's what it says about what happened at the hospital. The doctor explained, "We defibrillated her once, one more time in the ER, and then finally she came back. But there was probably 27 to 28 minutes with limited or no oxygen," the report says. This is what the doctor is saying. "We don't know what happened. We're going to induce a coma to allow her body to relax while we're doing all these tests to try to figure out what happened." The doctor continued to explain, "Most people don't survive after 5 to 10 minutes of being without oxygen to the brain." And her name was Tina. If Tina pulled through, she would most likely have brain injuries that could leave her with a major brain handicap. So reeling from his wife's potential complications, her husband, Brian, stepped into Tina's ICU room for the very first time. And he says, she's vented. The thing's breathing for her. She's got all these tubes on her, and your eyes just immediately go to that monitor watching the heart rate thing, the chart, and hearing the beeping and seeing the numbers. It was crazy. But I had to be happy, too, that at least she was alive," says Brian. Well, meanwhile, the ICU waiting room is filled with family and friends waiting for her to come out, right? And they're all praying for her the whole time. The next day, when Tina's vital signs were back to normal, her doctors needed to determine if she could breathe on her own, so they decided to take her off the ventilator. Well, this is when Brian actually comes in and sees that she is now fully conscious, and she's able to breathe on her own, and he places a pen in her hand. And he says, and he holds a notebook so she can write. And she just started making marks, he says. I couldn't tell what it was, and I was almost shaking. I was fixed. I just held the book steady because I didn't want to drop it. Brian recalls, we figured out that she wrote ITSREAL. It's real. What's real? And I go, the pain? The hospital? She's slowly nodding her head. The eyes are closed. She's fully vented. She's moving all this. No. And then my daughter goes, heaven? And she nods yes. So as soon as someone said Jesus, then a peace came across her. And I looked at Dave and said, she's going to be just fine. Long story short, when Tina's later interviewed about it, she says, I just wanted to share that I saw Jesus' face. I saw him face to face. And the unbelievable rest and peacefulness of what I was experiencing was Jesus standing there with his arms open wide. And right behind Jesus standing there was this incredible glow. It was the most vibrant and beautiful yellow. Okay. Now, that's not unusual, Jimmy. You see this often on the part of people reporting NDEs, reporting near-death experiences, that they will have an experience that they interpret as, the glow, the light at the end of the tunnel, a heavenly kind of projection of some sort. And in this case, she sees Jesus face-to-face with his arms open wide. Now, if that was true, we'd have to explain it some way. And they always make it's NDE experiences. These near-death experiences are almost always described in a way that makes clear that the person is dead, not breathing, no heart, and she's here 25, 27 minutes without oxygen before she comes back. Now, they did some CPR on her to try, but, literally 25 to 27 minutes of unconsciousness. So the question then, I think that it really is trying to describe the fact that, no, she's not still alive and thinking while she's alive. The argument on all NDEs is that they are legally, clinically dead by definition. And I think that's part of where my concern is. How do we know where brain activity really stops? How do we know that there isn't a period of time after a report of brain activity, given the mechanisms we have to record brain activity? How do we know that there is no longer the chance of brain activity, right? Because that's what I'm wondering. So, and I think that's part of where I have some problems. I don't know if we know enough about the activity of the brain and how we're recording it to really know that somebody is, there's one say there's dead in the grave a week, and there is the report of no life signs kind of dead, and those are two different things. And I just don't know which of these folks are.
Yeah, it's definitely enough to understand why somebody might be skeptical. Hey, there is, even if we understood even if we could clearly delineate where life and death, where the line is, what do we know about psychology and psychological experiences to let us know whether or not this is something that is outside her that's causing her to experience this, or her own thoughts or desires to have this, or and we only have her word to take for this? We have to just take it on her testimony alone that this even happened to her. So I think that you can understand why somebody, especially somebody who's starting out with a belief against Christianity, where they're not Christian, they're part of another religion, or they're atheist, why they would have ample reasons to hear this story and go, yeah, I don't know about that, and kind of just hand wave it away.
Yeah, and to be fair now, there are, like you just raised an issue that has been a problem for us when we're trying to talk to witnesses or trying to talk to suspects or victims, this idea that I don't have any way to corroborate the claims of her observations. But there are a number of these NDEs where somebody will have this experience post-death, by definition, or however you want to put it, and they will leave their bodies, and they'll have a view of the room, for example, that is hovering over their lifeless body, in which they see some detail or aspect of the room or the position of some object in the room that is previously unknown, and they report that when they come back to consciousness, and sure enough, they find this object on top of the counter or wherever on top of the cabinet that really could not be seen unless they actually. Now, of course, the question is, now look, is it just me? Is it just the old atheist in Jim Wallace that says, I don't know, do I even trust these? Because I got to tell you, my first default is, well, I don't even know how to trust that report. Like, I don't even know how long is it assembled. I'd have to go out and actually interview those witnesses to see, is it my own just kind of old atheistic skepticism that is dragging my feet here? I think if every single NDE involved the observation of some type of corroborative evidence, right? Involved the observation of something on top of a bookshelf, or, some out of body. I hovered above the whole building and I saw there were 3 broken tiles on the top of the building on the left-hand side. And sure enough, we go find 3 broken tiles. If every NDE had something like that, I think I'd be more inclined, right? Because the repeated kind of nature of these NDEs would be overwhelming. But I guess I'm afraid in some ways that my own old skepticism is keeping me back here.
Yeah, I think that's the big question is, can we corroborate any of these experiences? I think that there's going to be plenty which we could absolutely not corroborate. And I think that's typically when I hear somebody had a near-death experience. I'm thinking it's one of these experiences. They see the tunnel of light, they experience Jesus or God, or they see a dead relative or something like that. We just have, if they're real or not, we just have to take the person's word for it. We really can't use some other way to judge whether this is a true experience or not, some way to corroborate it. But if we could corroborate even one story, what does that really tell us about the nature of reality, the nature of the world?
Right. Okay, so let's take a quick break. We'll come back. We'll talk about one of the other reasons why I am hesitant to accept NDEs that really, for me, is the bigger deal killer. And we'll talk about that right after the break. Okay, so now what I want, Jimmy, let's be fair. We've got good friends like Gary Habermas, who has done really pretty decent work on this, and a lot of folks who make a case from NDEs are doing it in such a way that they think it is much more powerful than we're suggesting even in the first segment. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I think that if we just focus on the near-death experiences where somebody comes back and tells us something about heaven or about the afterlife, or they experience God in some way, well, it's really hard to know if they're telling the truth or not, because the rest of us, we don't exactly know what heaven is going to be like. We can't go and compare. I guess you could compare it to Scripture, but even Scripture is not that clear about the afterlife and what our experience there will be like. So it's very difficult to test whether somebody's experience there is real or not. We just have to take their word for it. But some people will come back, will have these near-death experiences, but when they come back, they won't make a claim about something they experienced in the afterlife or that they experienced with God. What they will do is they'll make a claim about the real world. One example that comes to the top of my mind is somebody who had come back and they made a statement that they had seen somebody a couple, I think they were like a couple hospital rooms over, and they, even though they'd never met this person before, had some type of knowledge about the affliction the person was being treated for or something in their personal life. And they make this claim. They come back to life, or they are revived, whether they died or not. They are near death, they are revived, and now they're making a claim about the real world that you could test. Now you can go a few doors over and see, is that person really there? Are they really experiencing whatever affliction they're experiencing? And what people will say is that there are at least a number of examples that can be corroborated. In fact, some people will say that there are many, many examples of people coming back, making a claim about not the afterlife, but the physical world, the world around us, Earth, make some type of physical or material claim, and that when somebody goes to verify it, it turns out that the person was right, even though they should not have had any other way to have that information.
So someone like Gary Habermas, for example, he's saying, I'm going to exclude all of these that are not reporting a feature of the real world, because you might interpret those as subjective experiences.
Yeah,
so
real world meaning like the material, physical world. I think I said real world earlier. We're trying to determine, is the real world include non-material things? But yeah, definitely the material world.
Yeah. Right, the material world. In other words, the world outside of our own internal experiences. In other words, some feature of, like, for example, the geography of where we are that is objectively grounded in the object of the geography rather than subjectively grounded in the experience or opinions of the NDE experiencer. So that's what you're saying. Hey, if we just eliminate, okay, fine. If you think you can't verify some of these things, let's just eliminate all of those who don't make claims about the geography around them or about something we can actually corroborate. And then you start looking at just the ones where you got some type of exterior corroboration. They think there's enough there. Now, my question, of course, is, and I don't know enough about this but my sense of it is, and after talking to people, is that they are not specifically the same, the experiences that people have. that I would expect, if I'm raised within a Christian culture, to have a Christian sense of the afterlife. If I'm raised within a Buddhist culture, to have a Buddhist sense of what the world is really like, to have a Muslim sense of what the world and the afterlife might be like. And it seems to me that if we're going to look at these NDEs, that we ought to be able to have precisely the same observations about the next life in each one of these. And what I'm seeing so far seems like they do vary a bit. And it does seem to be based on what, like, even if you're a well-read Christian from Scripture, you're going to have a much clearer view of what you think the afterlife is like than if you're just somebody who has gleaned your notions of the afterlife from movies. Even though you call yourself a Christian, you've just gleaned this from literature rather than from Scripture, or from movies rather than Scripture. You've got a different view. But let me just say the thing that really bothers me, not that it bothers me, but that I think causes my hesitancy, and that is that I have done a number of cases where I might have 10 pieces of evidence that are so unrefutable that if I offer these, the defense is going to have a really hard time trying to negotiate with those in front of a jury because they are just really solid. Now, I might have 15 pieces, but the other 5 could be interpreted one way or the other. Well, I'm going to leave those other 5 out of my case proper. I'm only going to use the 10 that he cannot reinterpret some other way. If he wants to bring the other 5 in, great. I'll just show you how they can be interpreted in view of the prosecution. But I'm not going to bring those in because they can be interpreted one of 2 ways. And so because they can, to me, they're not effective in front of a jury, right? Because I basically just pitched a ball in a way that the defense can swat at it. And I don't want the defense to be able to do that. There are alternative explanations for, I would say, I would just venture a guess that the number of uncorroborated personal experience NDEs outnumbers the number that can be corroborated by some observation of the world around them after death.
I think that it might just matter who we think is going to be on the jury. And part of this is going to be knowing something about the person we're speaking to. I would actually think that, I think you're right. A lot of people would probably hear the idea of near-death experience and immediately write it off. They don't want to listen to it. And if that's the kind of person you're talking to, yeah, that's not going to be a useful tact. But there might be somebody out there who, because it's a little unusual, might pay you heed. And if you are talking to that kind of person, this might be useful. But I think it's also important to think about what we're saying the evidence points to. You know, when I first heard about the idea of near-death experiences, I thought this was going to be evidence that pointed to the Christian God. Somebody was close to death, they encountered Jesus, they come back, and now this is evidence that Jesus exists. But I think if we limit ourselves just to those near-death experiences where somebody has who is close to death, is somehow able to gain knowledge about the material world around them that they would not otherwise have had, then this would not point specifically to Christianity, to Jesus. They didn't experience Jesus. It could point to a number of religions. So it's not specific in that way, but it does suggest that there may be something beyond the material plane.
Yes.
That somehow their consciousness, because they're close to death, is able to experience or learn something about the greater world around them that if they were limited to their body, they would not have known. And so I think the key here is that the near-death experience, I don't know that we could use it to argue for Jesus, but I think we could argue it that this suggests there's something beyond the material world. I think that's the best we could do with them.
No, I think that's an absolutely critical distinction, because I think that this does seem to me that if we can demonstrate that people who have no brain activity, as measured physically in the brain, still have mental activity that transcends this, then I think we do have a good piece of evidence for dualism, at the very, very least. The idea that you are more than just a material being, that there is something immaterial in your thoughts, that kind of what steps you closer to the notion of being a soulish, immaterial creature in possession of an immaterial mind that cannot be measured quantitatively through physical, biological experiences in your brain. Now, of course, the skeptic in me says, well, yeah, but do we know that we have really captured a lack of brain activity in the instrumentation that we have, or is there some level of brain activity that our instruments don't catch? So that we're just missing that part. But I think that, okay, that's fine. If that evidence emerges in the future that's more concrete, then we just cross that bridge when we get there. For now, this does appear to be a good evidence. If regardless of what your thoughts are about the afterlife, you're having thoughts. And if we're doing this without brain activity, that does, to me at least, take a step in this direction. So it's part. And one last thing before we go. I just know that a lot of us don't think about the value of a cumulative case. Remember, it's death by 1,000 paper cuts. And what this means is that each paper cut is not the silver bullet. It's a paper cut. And it's the cumulative nature of all those paper cuts that makes the strong case. And I think that's the difference we need to help people understand.
Yeah, it's a piece of evidence that's consistent with the Christian worldview. It's one more thing that supports the idea that we think about the world, but it's not necessarily going to tell you everything about Christianity.
Good point. Okay, that's all we have time for today.
Thanks for joining us in this edition of the Cold Case Christianity Broadcast. We'll see you next week.
To hear more from J. Warner Wallace, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For more information on this week's topic, visit youtube.com/coldcasechristianity with J. Warner Wallace. Thank you for joining us on this Cold Case Christianity broadcast.